Welcome to Your Bird Story, a podcast about everyday people and their relationships and interactions with wild birds. I'm your host, Georgia Silvera Seamans. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Your Bird Story. Today, I'm joined by Dudley Edmondson, and I'm going to turn it over to him to make introductions.
Well, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm Dudley Edmondson. I live here in Duluth, Minnesota, which is probably the furthest north large city in Minnesota. We're about 180 miles south of the Canadian border on the shores of Lake Superior. It's a great place for bird migration. We have Hawk Ridge Nature Reserve here just a mile or so from my house. And as a result, I get to see a lot of amazing birds in my backyard as they migrate through. I've been a birder probably for 45 years or so. I started in high school, actually my senior year in high school, maybe 11th grade, 12th grade, somewhere around then, and had an art teacher that got me into birds. And I was just fascinated at his ability to identify birds with what seemed to be almost no information. He just would take a glance at something and know exactly what it was. And I'm like, how do you do that? I want to do that. So I eventually, got better and better at birds and birding and moved here from Columbus, Ohio in the 90s to become a professional nature photographer. So birds and bird watching and wildlife photography kind of became a huge part of my life. So I'm glad to be here and glad to be on the program.
Thanks, Dudley. Oh, so I have so many questions firing in my brain after your introduction. How did you get good at identifying birds and birding?
Bird calls was a huge part of it. Back in those days, I listened to bird calls on cassettes and CDs as I drove to a place to go birding. So if it took 30 minutes to go birding, I would listen to Audubon recordings. They'd say, "Oh, this is a black-capped chickadee," and then they would play the song. And, so after doing that over and over and over again, and then actually hearing birds in the field, seeing birds, and photographing them, I just got better and better at it. And now I don't go birding anymore. I'm always watching birds. There's never a time when I'm not interested in birds. Birds are like food, like breathing, like sleeping for me. The only time probably that I'm not watching birds or paying attention is probably when I'm asleep. But there is really no set aside time or place to watch birds. If I'm in parking lot at some grocery store or big department store, I might be watching birds as I'm loading things into my car or listening for birds, because that's probably when I'm in that situation, I'm mostly listening. So I might hear blue jays and cardinals and chickadees and things like that. Or, if I'm out fly fishing or mountain biking, you're always aware of birds. And so you don't necessarily need binoculars or anything like that, because my brain after 45 years or so is just attuned to birds. So it's always listening, always listening. I consider birds and bird watching as part of my identity at this stage in my life.
I'm reading a book right now. It's called Bird Girl. Bird Girl, Looking to the Skies in Search of a Better Future, was written by Maya Rose Craig. She talks about this exact same thing, and I think the word she uses is absorbing. She is always absorbing birds. The minute she wakes up to the minute she goes to sleep, between these points, the birds are around. She can't move through life without being aware of birds.
And that just becomes part of your state of mind after decades and decades of doing it. And, part of also for me over the years, I've had to ask the question, what is it about birds that endures them to people, gets people who've never really been much into nature and the outdoors, but somehow birds, they pay attention to birds. And so, I've asked that question and thought about it a lot. And the only thing I've come up with is that birds spark joy, that their songs, they have this positive demeanor, they have this joy about them as they move around and do the things they do. They're beautiful in terms of color. And so all of those things combine, and also the ability to fly. I think humans are jealous that we can't do that without an airplane. So I think all of those things combined is really what makes people really enjoy birds and bird watching. That's what I've come up with.
You started out by grounding yourself in a location. I'm curious about the hawks and other birds you saw this past migration season. What was it like for you? Which species showed up in your yard?
It varies quite a bit. I know birds that should normally be around and what times of the year they should be there because I do keep data for my yard. I've been keeping data for this property ever since I lived here some 32, 33 years ago. And so I have sometimes, in the heat of the season, I have daily eBird checklists that I create. From my location, I'm probably a mile and a half from Hawk Ridge Nature Reserve. I mean, it's the reason I bought the house is I can stand in the middle of the street and see the ridge from my house. And so I feel like the ridge on one side of me and Lake Superior on the other side of me, there's this sort of corridor of passage for birds that are coming down the North Shore. Birds come out of the north and the west, out of Canada, Alaska, to come down the Mississippi Flyway. And when they hit the shore of Lake Superior, they put the brakes on hard and make a right-hand turn and come down the shore. So they come out of the west to east, they hit the lake, and they go, I'm not crossing that big body of water. I'm heading south down the shore here and stay safe. And then they hit the St. Louis River, and then they continue heading south and east into Wisconsin. So birds are just always around. In the spring, I had some great warblers. I had water thrushes and Blackburnian warblers in my pond, Tennessee warblers like crazy, just goofy everywhere. I got film and still images of Tennessee warblers. And then in the fall, the hawks came through really nice. I had golden eagles and bald eagles and rough legs and red tails and sharp-shinned hawks. Had a couple peregrines. Actually had 3 peregrines this
Oh
year.
my
Had one in
gosh.
the spring and 2 in the fall. It's the reason I lived here, and I've landscaped my yard to be a bird magnet. And that doesn't mean, everything's all pretty and neat and in rows by height, by color. There's none of that going on in my yard. Nature loves chaos. So my yard probably looks like an unkept space, but that is exactly what birds and wildlife want. They want places to forage, they want places to find nest material, and places to hide from predators
Hmm.
and food source and water. And so I provide all those things in my yard. And birds, sometimes passerines come into my yard and they'll sit around and do nothing, literally for up to an hour, just sitting on a branch because they feel safe. And so for me, that's an indication that I'm doing it right. If birds come in my yard and they chill out, if they had a cigarette and a beer that they could do, they probably would. I mean, it's just they come in so chill, so relaxed. They'll just sit in the branches and stare off or go to sleep. I have a lot of that where birds will get on my wood chip path and they'll lay down there and stir up the wood chips, which then stirs up little ants. And I think they're taking dirt baths. I've had thrushes and sparrows do that. I've had merlins sit around, so I feel like I'm doing something right because birds seem to love my yard.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here in sort of like awe at the list of species that you just went through. Has your sort of habitat yard influenced your neighbors? Are there other folks on your street who are doing this too because of you?
You know, my front yard, I put a prairie in about 2.5 years ago, and that has influenced a lot of people because I have the genus species tags for every plant that I've planted. I've got signage out there about it being a wildlife, habitat. And so people come by and ask me questions all the time about plants, what plants to plant. I went with a company that specializes in native gardens, and I chose the plants I wanted in my yard and just said, hey, deliver these 200 plants. My wife and I will plant them all. And we did that. And so, it's full of big blue stem and different kinds of liatris, sunflowers. So all year round, that garden provides habitat and food. In the summer, of course, it's providing for pollinators, but in the fall and the winter, there are, lots of seeds for birds and mice that will feed out there. And so there's always some activity in that garden. And I've noticed that down my street now, there must be easily 4 or 5 new native prairie gardens since I put mine in, because people come by and they actually stop and talk and chat, with each other if I'm not out there. And then people say, I love your garden. And so trying to get people to understand that rewilding and letting things go natural is not a bad thing. I think we all have in this country this Eurocentric mindset that everything needs to be neat and controlled and orderly. And that's just complete opposite of what nature really truly wants. And putting in cultivars like hostas and roses and daylilies, those kinds of things are not native in general, and they don't really provide anything much for wild animals. And so if you landscape your yard with native plants, you'll see a greater variety of wildlife and birds that come to your yard.
So I'm going to ask you, do you have like a favorite plant bird pairing, like goldfinch on echinacea?
That's what I was going to say. Goldfinch on echinacea. I mean, that's a good pairing. I have echinacea and tall woodland sunflower and Maximilian sunflower in that garden I've been talking about. And so it's right out my living room window. It provides a barrier to the street. So in the summertime, I don't see cars. I see just giant sunflowers. And in the late summer, the goldfinch move into that, they start working those seeds. As far as I know, goldfinch, they nest much later. They don't do the June, July stuff like most birds. They wait for the seed pods of certain plants and the Santa Clauses, if you want to call them that, to come out, and they use some of that in their nesting material. Thistles and things and all that stuff don't produce that stuff until late in the year. And so they come in, and there's several of them, half dozen sometimes or more, that are in that garden. And it's just, it's pretty. And I think also the neighbors tend to like that. They come walk by with their dogs, and there's goldfinch. They can see the goldfinch, working those seed heads and stuff. So, yeah. So I want to believe that I influenced people, which is both intentional and unintentional. So
It's a good way to be an influencer, right?
yeah, it is.
Better.
Much better, much better.
So you mentioned, or you talked about your photography. You photographed the Tennessee warblers that were just kind of like dripping in your yard. What is your approach to photography, photographing birds and landscapes?
I used to do it professional. Well, I did it professionally for many, many years, but the stock photography market has pretty much dried up. I mean, I have a friend who still does stock nature photography, but he says he's lucky if he gets, $15, $20 for a photo. And back in the day, you could get $100 a photo. It's dropped quite a bit. So now most of my photography is just, to use for social media and potentially to illustrate a book I'm working on or something at a particular time. But yeah, photography has changed as far as how I do it. It requires a lot of patience. It's not a thing where you can, sit out there for 5 or 10 minutes and expect to get a photo. It could be hours. And being self-employed, working from home, it's really easy for me to just walk out in the backyard with my camera gear and put up a blind or sit on my deck and be really quiet. And my water feature pond seems to really draw the birds in. And if I sit there, I can get great shots. And so I'd say the number one requirement really is patience, because these days, even the cameras do most of the work. They focus, they get great exposure. You just need to be willing to sit for hours. And then also just to have the ability to anticipate and be ready and follow stuff. And so patience, I'd say, is probably the number one thing I think is required.
So probably photographing people much easier. Did you take the photographs for your books?
Yeah, when I first started doing photography professionally, I used to say the only way you'd get me to photograph a person would be to put cardboard wings on them, because I was such a bird nerd at that time. Nowadays, I have, really turned that around, and I really enjoy photographing people, particularly people of color, and trying to do whatever I can to highlight the stories of Black and Brown folks in science and nature and conservation careers, and just trying to put a brown face on conservation, because so much of it is white males and pocket protectors and lab coats, and that mindset that only people who can do nature and do science are white people or white males. And I just don't see any reason to uphold that myth. So I do everything I can to tear that myth down.
And your first book, Black and Brown Faces in America's Wild Places, which I don't have a copy of, but your
Oh,
second book, People the Planet Needs Now. I do have a copy of that one, and it's really wonderful. I love that you centered people's voices. So we're hearing
mhm.
from the folks who are part of your book. And I'm a Black woman. It's really great to see people outdoors. Black and brown people, they look gorgeous and happy, and the landscapes are stunning. Can you talk about how you put this together? People the Planet Needs Now is just a really good book. And when it was published, it really resonated. And boy, right now, we definitely need this is what the world needs now.
Again, it goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago. I just feel like the voices of Black and Brown people in conservation and science are just muffled or ignored. The knowledge of Indigenous people is, again, ignored or pushed to the side. And I'm 100% certain that people of color can fill all of these spots and do these kinds of things, and particularly, highlighting young Black and Brown scientists so that we get more young people interested in STEM careers and things like that just seemed super important to me. So, I mean, I called in quite a few favors with folks, but there were lots of people in this book I'd never met in my life. And so, I just combined those two groups and tried to get a nice cross section of people and, let them tell their stories. Because as I went through this process with this book, I realized, just how often people's stories are told by someone else.
Mm.
And I just felt like I didn't want to be part of that kind of thing. It feels very extractive and disrespectful. And so, just in general, I want to just set the table and let the person tell their story. But, still, I end up editing down, condensing their words, but I don't change their words or the meanings of, what they told me. And so I end up basically more of an editor
Mm.
than a writer in that particular situation. And so that's kind of how I ended up creating these chapters and also getting people's buy-in and promising them that, hey, I'm not going to steal your story and make a bunch of money off of it and give you nothing and do that kind of thing, which I think oftentimes happens to people, particularly in the regular periodical media types, magazines and news stories and things like that. I feel like whoever the periodical, whatever, magazine or newspaper is, they get ad revenue.
Mm,
The writer gets paid for writing the story. The storyteller doesn't get anything.
mm,
And that's just like, really? Let's say Time Magazine gets $1 million for ad revenue. The writer gets, their normal salary. And then the person whose story they published gets nothing.
mm,
That just doesn't make sense to me. So I said, at least give people the dignity to tell their own personal story. I might not be able to pay you, but at least I give you the dignity of telling your own story, and I'm not going to change your words. And if I can pay you, I will pay you. If I can get a situation where you and I can share the stage together, I will make sure you get paid, just like I'm going to get paid to be there. So, I have tried to do that with a few of the folks in the book. I was successful. We would show up at a book event and they would sign books and the three of us would get paid, a stipend for being there. Yeah, just taking people's story and monetizing it just didn't feel right to me. I mean, and I'm still in that mindset. All the people in this book, any opportunity I have to have a situation where we share an event space, that all of us get paid for being there. So, like I said, it's happened once or twice, but not enough for me.
mm. Yeah, I just want to bring back up one of the things you said earlier on in talking about your process is that there are Black, Brown, Indigenous people who have the talent to fill these natural resource positions,
Mhm.
indoors and outdoors. It's also one of the things that comes out of the stories in the book is that we care about the planet. We
Yes.
have relationships with the whole spectrum of nature. And so there are all of these basically untruths that are told about us and our relationship with nature. And I think this book just sets the record straight for those who didn't know. Congratulations. It's wonderful to have it out in the world. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about what it was like to sign the America's Great Outdoors Initiative. We started out before recording talking about how time is kind of weird. And I feel
Yes.
like that was really a long time ago.
Oh yeah, for real. For real, that was a long time ago.
But sort of perhaps like a moment of hope and joy, if you don't mind sharing what that was like.
I was present at the event. I got an invite. I want to say Fish and Wildlife sort of got me through the door because it was not a thing that, the public was invited to. You had to get some kind of clearance from a federal agency to be present. And so I was there. I remember my friend Rue Mapp of Outdoor Afro, she was there. She got a better seat than me. She was in the front row. I was in the middle to the back of the space. But it was just nice to be in the room and also to just be, in the same space as a sitting Black president of the United States. The protocols, though, were really something you would only experience if you were lucky once in your lifetime, which is that once the president enters the building, you are not allowed to leave wherever you are.
Hmm.
So if you're in your office, you're in the bathroom, you're in the hall, you cannot leave until he leaves the building. That to me was interesting. But when he entered the room, it was like, is this real? It just felt like something that would happen in a movie. I mean, he walked in from, the right-hand side of the stage, and I want to say the space probably held maybe somewhere between 300 and 500 people, so it wasn't gigantic. And so he walked in. Of course, all of the folks were with him, from the Department of Interior, Secretary of Interior folks, and USDA people, and different assistants and things like that. And I actually remember passing off that first copy, or the first Black and Brown Faces. I passed it off to one of his handlers in the hope that he would get to see it. And then I actually did give one to the Department of Interior head at that time. I can't remember who it was, but I did give him a copy as well. And I want to say that maybe on that trip, I also ran into Julian Bond in the airport, and I gave him a copy. He was at Reagan. And so I remember handing him a copy as well. Can't remember which way I was going. Yeah, I remember giving him a copy, and he looked at me like, "Who are you?" And I thought to myself, I don't care. You're Julian Bond, and I have a book about Black people. So I'm giving it to you whether you want it or not. And I thanked him, put it in his hand, and he said something about, this would be a good book to have in the hands of young people, you know, who are interested in those kinds of careers and things like that. And I remember that day. So it was certainly a once in a lifetime experience. And I still have my name tag. You had to have official credentials. And so I still have those credentials, which is pretty cool.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I want to end by asking you what you're looking forward to as a person who lives and sleeps birds.
I know there's a movement or whatever, bring birds back, something along those lines. I really hope that as a human species, we can actually think more about ourselves as being part of nature and not above it, and that every organism in nature has a purpose, serves some kind of function, and that we start to see ourselves as part of the whole and not looking at nature from a distance and saying, we're better than that. And so I just hope that conservation of birds and things really gets better, because right now, more and more people, I mean, there's more, I want to say there's like, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I think they said there's like 86 million people consider themselves to be, bird enthusiasts now. And that number has risen, obviously, since the pandemic. And so people have really, become bird aware. And so I want to believe that in itself could also help with conservation efforts. I did just finish an article for Cornell University's Living Bird magazine.
Okay.
That's coming out in the spring about the Joe Farm. I don't know if you've ever heard of Birds and Nature Tours in Alabama, and Christopher Joe. And so I just finished a story about Christopher Joe and his family farm, and that'll be out in the spring issue of Living Bird magazine. So I'm looking forward to that. So,
congratulations. I can't wait.
And again, it's from that perspective I let Christopher tell his story. I sort of set up who I was and how I got into birds, and then sort of gave Christopher the floor and let him tell his story. And so Living Birds seemed to think it was a very different angle from the way they've ever done stories, because their stories are so science-based. So this story is sort of human interest-based, about a family of Black conservationists and agriculturally savvy Black folks that have been in farming business for over a century. And they have become interested in birds, and they offer tours. And, you get the Mississippis and the swallowtail kites there in August, around the time of the Black Belt Birding Festival. And it's just been an amazing thing for folks. And so I just felt like, here's a story about Black conservationists. Let's see what we can do with it. And so the initial response was, this is different. would think about it for a second. And then it was like, yeah, we really like this. And so I'm really happy that they're going to do what I wrote up and the photos I submitted, have it out in the spring and features lots of images of Black and brown folks in the out of doors. And so I think that's also probably going to be different for the magazine. So I hope it goes really well.
It's great to be a part of that legacy, a century. That's a long time.
It's just every member of the family is on the farm and doing stuff, and he's raising his young daughter, and she's learning about birds and learning about agriculture and cattle farming, so it's going to carry over into the next generation. So he was kind enough to send me a picture of him and her with her little binoculars. I think that photo will really do a lot to get the readers of that magazine to see that here's a next generation of Black birders at whatever she is, 7, 9 years old. She's got her little cerulean blue binoculars and big smile on her face. And so I think that photo will resonate with folks.
Dudley, thank you so very much for spending this time with me and talking about you as not a birder, but just as someone for whom birds are a natural part of your life.
Yeah, I do remember being what I used to call a blitzo birder, which is you're not interested in anything that you've already seen. So it's like, oh, that's a chickadee. I don't care. Oh, there's a Caspian tern being seen down on the river. I've never seen one before. Let me go down there. In some ways, I consider it to have been a shallow point in my birding career where I was just interested in chalking up new birds. And I think that everybody, when you first get into bird watching, you will go through that phase of wanting to see new birds all the time. And if you've seen it, you might not be as interested in it. But now I find all birds interesting in some manner, even non-native birds, just watching their behavior and how they do what they do and all those kinds of things. And so I think it's a healthy addiction and habit and hobby to have. I hope more and more people, particularly people of color, discover birds.
Thanks again, Dudley.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Bird Story. Like, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Your Bird Story is an initiative of Local Nature Lab.